My name is Crispin Jensen, owner and founder of LifeStart Training. This week, we will be diving into industry standards, what works and what doesn't. In 2013, the Canadian Red Cross approached the CSA Group in an attempt to create a national standard for first aid competencies and training. In April 2014, the Advisory Council received strong support from regulatory members to create this national standard. There were 15 individuals who were considered experts that were invited to the October 22nd, 2014 workshop. Some of the key themes that arose during the meeting were: status quo is not an option. There needs to be a better policy in place for each jurisdiction. If there was a national standard, it could be updated more frequently and reflect scientific, evidence-based practice recommendations. A national standard would also ensure consistency at a national level with high quality and measurable training. As such, a national standard would not address all gaps. However, it would help in consistency because this is where we are lacking. Having a standard-based framework would require significant resources, however, in communication to have this project advanced. Okay, so at this current time, each jurisdiction or province or territory can basically make up its own first aid program and regulations unless they've adopted the CSA standards. So if somebody wants to take a first aid class in Ontario and then goes to work in Alberta, they would be required to have a new first aid certificate as it is not recognized interprovincially. There are currently no requirements or guidelines that specifically say, hey, here's what you have to have for equipment, or here are the relevant areas that instructors need to be proficient in. There is no outline for the content that explicitly states what you should be doing or the best practices for each component of the course that you are teaching. So we are sorely lacking in this area. Each national first aid provider basically follows the same standards, which are, limited requirements. They follow the 1 instructor to 18 participants. And equipment ratios typically range from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. However, there is no mention of the quality of equipment that should be used. So for example, the archaic blue foam mannequins versus the Preston or the Brighton mannequins. There are some significant differences between these. Out of hospital cardiac arrest survival rates have pretty much stagnated since 2012. We have almost a decade that we are not improving. So we kind of need to ask ourselves, why? Could it be that even though technology has advanced by leaps and bounds over the last decade, or maybe it's that first aid is still pretty much being taught the exact same way that it's always been taught? Because there's a lack of consistency and cohesion for industry standards at a national level, along with very limited auditing for programs, there seems to be a very large gap between what is acceptable and what is being taught. In my almost 5 years in the first aid industry, I have found so many gaps in how first aid is being taught. Frequent comments that I get from my participants are like, hey, are we breathing into people this year? I heard that breaths were taken out. And then, hey, are we doing 15 compressions? Weren't we just doing 10 compressions last year? Or wait, are we doing 5 and then 2 breaths? It appears that some instructors typically teach what they think the national standard should be, as opposed to what the scientific, evidence-based recommendations are. Now, let me go out and say this. This doesn't necessarily fall entirely back on the instructor, so it's not all their fault. It could be the corporations or the providers or the lack of communication within that corporation. There's no clear expectations set or guidelines as to why the changes are in effect and what's being taught. There doesn't seem to be any direct line of communication that could contribute, to increasing our out-of-hospital cardiac arrest along with our learners. These are some of the issues within the industry. We need to find a way to shorten the gap to provide quality program training coast to coast with very little variation. Allowing more virtual programs in the industry would enable proper cohesion with minimal ability to distort all of the information, as the core information would be delivered via virtual content. Furthermore, when discussing industry standards, the 2020 American Heart Association Guidelines for Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada edition mentioned virtual gamified learning as a viable option to help retention rates. Currently, any revisions like the October 2020 American Heart Association Guidelines usually take anywhere between 12 to 18 months for the recommendations and guidelines to be implemented in the day-to-day first aid training programs. This is a huge issue because participants are receiving information that is over a year old. There are no actual industry standards, just best practices for equipment ratios or instructor certification or instructor programs. We need to work as an industry to elevate these standards countrywide. Stay tuned next week for why better equipment is essential for retention, and as always, let us know if you have any comments.